Good evening. I'm Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwidler Chair of Judaic Studies here at Fordham and a co-director of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. And it is my great pleasure, honor, and really delight to welcome you all for this very, very special event. Last year, on Monday, November 4th, on the third day of the Hebrew month Cheshvan, we lost our dear friend and colleague, Anne Golomb Hoffman. And today, just 2 days after the Yortzeit, the anniversary of her passing according to the Hebrew calendar, we're here to celebrate Anne's life and to ensure her legacy lasts into the future. Anne was a key figure at Fordham in creating a space for Jewish studies, Jewish texts, and culture here. She was committed to building bridges, empathy, and understanding between different communities. And it is for this reason that after Anne's untimely death, we, the faculty at the Center for Jewish Studies, agreed to create an annual Anne Golomb Hoffman Memorial Lecture to continue her legacy. Today, we welcome you to this inaugural event. A longtime faculty in the English department and in the comparative literatures program, beloved by her students and colleagues, Anne left a deep mark on Fordham. As a scholar of modern Hebrew literature, Anne developed and led an annual colloquium in the Middle Eastern studies, attracting prominent speakers. And in the early 1990s, together with Professor Ed Bristow, Anne created a public forum devoted to Catholic-Jewish dialogue that became known as the Nostra Aetate Dialogues. The Nostra Aetate Dialogues offered a model that has survived at Fordham, even if the topics of such conversations are no longer devoted only to Jewish-Catholic dialogue. Anne became part of a group together with Father Jerry Blaszczak of the Society of Jesus, then Vice President for Mission, Professor Elsie Stern, who taught Hebrew Bible at the Theology Department, and Professor Russ Pierce in the law school. That group launched what still exists as the Jewish Text Reading Group. And today we have a really wonderful news announcement, and I want to invite Dean Jessica Lang to share this news with you. Jessica.
Thank you so much, Magda. I didn't have the privilege or the gift of knowing Anne Golomb Hoffman, although I feel sure our paths must have crossed being a fellow English professor and Jewish studies faculty member. So I wanted to try to find her voice in some of her writing. And in an essay she wrote entitled Housing the Past in Agnon's A Guest for the Night, she uses the first person voice at the very end. And I just wanted to read a really brief selection from that to share just this sense of presence that she brought for me. She writes, I am reminded of a medieval variant on the Midrash of the wise infant that Sholem cites. Why, asks Eleazar of Worms, a 13th century chassid, does the child forget his knowledge of Torah? Because if the child did not forget, the course of this world would drive it to madness if it thought about it in the light of what it knew. Agnon stands in the middle between forgetting and remembering, unable to complete either movement and perhaps defining himself through the tension between them. His novel is the product of that tension, the necessary forgetting that goes into the life of the individual in the world and the longing to remember, to go back and recapture. And to me, that holds so much meaning in this present world that we're existing in. I am so honored to share with you on this special day, sandwiched between the Yortzeit of Anne's passing and the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, which is tomorrow on October 28th, we are honored to share that thanks to a $1 million seed gift from the Hoffman family, Fordham is planning to establish the Anne Golomb Hoffman Endowed Professorship in Jewish Studies. Yes. This extraordinary commitment honors the memory of Professor Anne Golomb Hoffman, a scholar whose intellectual curiosity and humanism shaped generations of students. The endowed chair will ensure that her legacy of rigorous thought, empathy, and interdisciplinary inquiry continues to inspire Fordham for decades to come. Endowed professorships are among the most powerful investments we can make in a university's future, all the more so in this moment. The Anne Golomb Hoffman Endowed Fund will allow us to recruit and retain outstanding faculty in Jewish studies and literature, and add a public voice of Jewish studies at a time when a nuanced understanding of identity, ethics, and belonging is more vital than ever. The gift honors the memory of Anne Golomb Hoffman, whose research blended literature, psychoanalysis, history, and art, and her commitment to building bridges across disciplines and communities. The Hoffman's family's generosity provides a remarkable foundation, but this is just a beginning. To bring this vision fully to life, we invite others who believe in the transformative power of Jewish studies to join in. So far, more than 70 individuals have now contributed another $50,000 toward the professorship in the last few weeks. Together, we can secure a professorship that anchors Fordham as a leader in this field and enriches the intellectual fabric of our university. To the Hoffman family, thank you so much for your vision and trust. And to all of you here tonight, thank you for being part of this moment of growth and hope. If you're inspired by what you've heard and would like to learn how you can make an impact on this effort, members of Fordham's development team are here this evening and will be delighted to speak with you. May this new professorship stand as a lasting tribute to learning, dialogue, and the enduring spirit of inquiry that defines Fordham, and to create a lasting legacy of what Anne stood for. And now I want to invite Dr. Ilana Hoffman to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Is this okay? And thank you for people who are online and here and present. Some of the comments I'm going to make have been said already, but it's what I have written out. This past Shabbat, on the third day of the Hebrew month of Mar Heshvan, was the first Yortzeit, the ritual remembrance of Anne's death, which occurred on November 4th, 2024. Anne was scheduled to speak the following week alongside Karina Hogan and Ilana Pardes about Ilana's book on Ruth. That conversation, which she greatly anticipated, never took place. In fact, on the day before Anne died, we saw the award-winning movie, The Shape of Water, in preparation for her discussion. Instead, we're here tonight for the inaugural Anne Golomb Hoffman Memorial Lecture at the Center for Jewish Studies of Fordham University. At some point, there will also be an Anne Golomb Hoffman lecture at the History of Psychiatry Division at Cornell University School of Medicine. Throughout this process, it has felt surreal planning for a lecture to be given in her name rather than one she herself was preparing to deliver. In thinking what I would say this evening, several people and activities came to my mind. Please excuse me for not including other important colleagues and academic ventures which Anne was involved. There were two colleagues and friends with whom Anne connected during her early days at Excel in 1979. Connections which endured until her death, Patricia Clough and Elizabeth Stone. Andrew Clark and Anne conducted the Matteo Ricci Seminar from its inception in 2010 until the 22-23 academic year. The Matteo Ricci Seminar is but one example of Anne's devotion to work with many, many students, promoting their intellectual curiosity, as well as providing them with skills to more effectively utilize their inner strengths. When Anne reconfigured her life, shifting her teaching activities away from Fordham, she continued working with students, such as at the Fortune Society with formerly incarcerated adults, as well as at the Asian University for Women in Bangladesh. When Anne became emerita, Mary Bly, sorry about that. Mary Bly was chair of English. Mary was instrumental in arranging for Anne to display her artwork at the Lincoln Center Ildiko Butler Gallery in October 23. The title of the show describes the breadth of Anne's art. reconfiguring, drawings, painting, mixed media. Shoni Enlow, Chair of English, was very gracious last year in arranging a memorial service 30 days after Anne's sudden, untimely death. Karina Hogan and Anne collaborated a great deal around a variety of activities connected to Jewish studies. Karina followed Anne as co-head along with Jason Morris of the Jewish Text Group, which was an important intellectual activity for Anne. This selection of colleagues is but a small sample of the many communities that sustained Anne. Our family is thankful for all that has been done to ensure that Anne's spirit, love of teaching, and deep appreciation of learning and scholarship will continue. To that end, we are especially grateful to Magda Tedder. Anne always spoke very highly of Magda's dedication and creativity in leading Jewish studies at Fordham. We're very honored on behalf of Anne for Magda's unwavering efforts to perpetuate Anne's zeal for teaching and promoting rigorous thinking. This memorial lecture is an indication of Magda's devotion to continue the legacy of Anne's contribution to the interdisciplinary scholarship of Israeli and Jewish subjects. In that vein, it is very humbling for our family that Magda proposed the creation of a second chair in Jewish studies, the Anne Golomb Hoffman Chair. To this end, we have committed significant funds. I didn't realize it was going to be announced, the number, towards the establishment of this chair. Anne had a great impact on generations of students, colleagues, and all of us. The creation of this chair will allow the center to continue the work prized by Anne. We're extremely thankful to those who have thus far contributed to the endowed fund in Anne's name and hope that others will join us. In closing, I wish to share the words with which I end a poem written a few weeks ago. The poem was stimulated by Ilana's title, Ruth, A Migrant's Tale. The title, as well as the theme of the poem, is migrations. The ending lines read as follows. Who was Anne Golomb Hoffman? Many generations from now, they will ask. A daughter, sister, lover, wife, mother, grandmother, aunt, friend. But most of all, someone who encourages students, us all, to think. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Vlasta Vranješ. I teach in the English department. Anne was my much-loved mentor and much-loved friend. My colleague Shani Enlow, who chairs our department, could not be here tonight, so I will read what Shani has written for this occasion. On behalf of the English department, it's an honor to join Professors Tedder and Hogan in welcoming you to the Anne Golomb Hoffman Memorial Lecture. Anne was a beloved and profoundly respected member of our department, even before it was called English at Lincoln Center. From 1979 until her retirement in 2023, when she was named Professor Emerita. She was integral in building the department into the diverse, collaborative, interdisciplinary community it is today. We in English owe so much to Anne's leadership, both her official leadership during her time as department co-chair, during the restructuring of the university and the unification of the campuses, and to her unofficial leadership throughout her tenure as an admired and oft consulted colleague, teacher, and institutional citizen. Anne's wise counsel and committed participation in department life were unparalleled. I know I speak for the whole department when I say that we are deeply gratified to contribute to the efforts to create an endowed chair in her honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And interested in being part of this amazing endeavor, you can either scan the QR code or pick up a beautiful flyer that tells you everything you need to know about the fund, the goal, and memory, and also the way to give. So they will be available in the around as you are leaving. But I wanted to give you an update that just literally came hot off the press this afternoon. Inspired by the generosity of the Hoffman family, former university trustee Joel Pickett and his wife Joan have decided to contribute $100,000 towards the Anne Golomb Hoffman Endowed Fund in support of Jewish studies. So we are going to get there. So with this exciting update, I want to invite our colleague, Karina Martin Hogan, who will introduce the speaker and be a respondent then to her talk. Karina Martin Hogan has been a member of the theology department at Fordham since 2005. Prior to that, she taught at the St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire, and she received her degrees from Swarthmore's in the classics, her master's of arts from the doctorate from the Divinity School at University of Chicago. Her research has been on the deuterocanonical and non-canonical literature in early Judaism. She has particular interest in wisdom literature and apocalyptic literature. Recently, her research has focused on the book of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible, and approaching it from feminist and contextual perspectives. She's currently the associate chair of the theology department at the Lincoln Center campus, and she has been a very close friend and collaborators with Anne, including in the Jewish text group. So Karina, please join us.
It's hard to believe that the last time I saw Anne was almost exactly a year ago. We had gotten together on the last Wednesday in October with the Jewish text group, which now you know is a faculty reading group that's been going for more than 20 years. It was through that group, which I joined soon after arriving at Fordham, that I got to know Anne, who quickly became a mentor and later a friend. After that meeting, she and I chatted a bit about the lecture by Ilana Pardes on Ruth, A Migrant's Tale, that she and I were to respond to the following week. I took her upstairs to see my office, which had been her office for many years, and which I had just moved into following her reconfiguration. I said goodbye, see you next week. It was unthinkable, but less than a week later, she would be gone from us. I'm so torn right now. On the one hand, I feel honored to be taking part in the inaugural Anne Golomb Hoffman Memorial Lecture. And on the other, it feels so wrong that she's not here with us. Nevertheless, I think Anne would be happy that this lecture that she and I prepared for is happening now as a way of remembering her. And so my first task is to introduce our speaker, Ilana Pardes, who has also been a role model for me from afar for many years, as I have been assigning chapters of her books on the Hebrew Bible to my students since shortly after I arrived at Fordham. Counter Traditions in the Bible, a feminist approach from 1992, and the biography of ancient Israel, National Narratives in the Bible from 2002, have been especially influential on my own approach to teaching the Hebrew Bible. She has also written some wonderful books on the reception of the Bible in Anglo-American and Hebrew literature, notably Melville's Bibles from 2008 and Agnon's Moonstruck Lovers, The Song of Songs in Israeli Culture, as well as the Song of Songs, a biography in the Lives of Great Religious Books series from Princeton University Press in 2019. So I was delighted, but not really surprised, to learn that she had published Ruth, A Migrant's Tale in 2022, around the time that I started working on my own book on Ruth. It's a wonderful book, like all of her books, and I'm honored to be discussing it with her this evening. Ilana Pardes is the Catherine Cornell Professor of Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She completed her PhD under the direction of Robert Alter at the University of California, Berkeley, after which she taught at Princeton University for 2 years before returning to Israel in 1992 to begin teaching at the Hebrew University. She has been back in North America as a visiting professor or research fellow several times, including at UC Berkeley, Harvard University, the Catt Center at the University of Pennsylvania, last year at Princeton, and this year as a visiting professor at the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Ilana Pardes.
Thank you for this very generous and moving introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. It is a great honor to deliver the inaugural lecture in memory of Professor Anne Golomb Hoffman. As you just heard, I was invited to give a talk last year and was thrilled to hear that Anne and Karina would be the respondents. And then, all of a sudden, this unexpected sad news. But I was delighted when I was invited to take part in this event, and we can somehow complete that initiative of last year. I met Anne many decades ago in the beginning of the 1990s at a conference in New York on women's writing and questions of gender. And it was the only time I met her in person. But in my work, I always felt close to Anne. We shared so many passions, from feminism and psychoanalysis to questions of exile and migration. Above all, in my work on Agnon, first in my book, Agnon's Moonstruck Lovers, and then in Gleaning with Agnon in Ruth's Field, I engage in an ongoing dialogue with Anne's groundbreaking book. It's really a landmark in the field, Between Exile and Return, S.Y. Agnon and the Drama of Writing, published in 1991. So in my talk today on the Book of Ruth and its reception, I will aim to continue my dialogue with Anne. But before we move on to Ruth, a few words of gratitude. I'm very grateful to Professor Karina Hogan and to Professor Magda Tetter for the invitation to give this lecture and for their generous hospitality. And special thanks go to Anne's family. I'm really very grateful to you for including me in this very special memorial event. And congratulations for the endowment. Terrific news. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with a few comments about the Book of Ruth itself, the text, and then talk a little bit about the, my notion of the afterlives of the Book of Ruth, from late antiquity until Toni Morrison. But I'll focus on closer. Okay. So we'll begin with the biblical text itself, and then a few words about the reception of the Book of Ruth, and then I'm going to focus on Agnon's take on the Book of Ruth as my final section. The Book of Ruth offers the most elaborate tale of a woman to be found in the Bible, but even this relatively detailed account is astonishingly laconic. The Book of Ruth is not really a book. It is only 4 chapters long, more of a short story or a very short story than a book. To write a biography of Ruth thus means to become a gleaner, to gather bits and pieces from sparse scenes that are replete with lacunae. And yet, despite its ellipses, Ruth's cryptic tale is remarkable for its capacity to provide, with but few vignettes, a vibrant portrait of one of the most intriguing characters in the Bible. Ruth's tale of migration is an unusual one. Elsewhere in the Bible, in the great stories of migration in Genesis and in Exodus, male characters are the ones to prevail. Here, a woman is set on center stage, and the specificities of her life are spelled out with distinct verve. We follow Ruth through various stages, from the moment she leaves Moab as a childless widow, determined to join Naomi, to the complex process of acculturation in Bethlehem, beginning with her struggle to survive as a gleaner in the barley fields and ending with her marriage to a local, Boaz, and her giving birth to Oved. What makes Ruth's migratory tale all the more exceptional is the fact that she's a Moabite. So not only is she a woman, but she's a foreign woman. It is the story of a Moabite woman who, on moving to Bethlehem, not only becomes a member of the people of Israel, but also the foremother of King David. Ruth emerges on stage only on the road between Moab and Bethlehem, on leaving her home and homeland and heading to the land of Judah, a land she had not known hitherto. With remarkable flair, Ruth endorses chesed, kindness, as her guideline. So now you know what's going to happen later on, but hope you'll still be surprised when we get to it. This is an illustration by William Blake. His more famous biblical illustrations are those of the book of Job, but this is a wonderful illustration as well, because it really captures that dramatic moment on the road. You see Ruth on the one hand clinging to Naomi, and Orpah, her sister-in-law, heading back to Moab, after Naomi convinces them to go back to Moab and I'll follow her. But you see they're sort of down and out, barefoot. Not that the Bible gives you any details, but I think it's suitable interpretation, because first of all, women usually do not go on their own on the road. It's a male zone. And only if they're in some kind of dire condition will you find them on the road. And this is definitely a dire conditions. They're all widows, they're penniless. And now Naomi wants to head back to Bethlehem. And you have this sort of separation between the women and the pain of it. And I think that Blake really captures it, but it's on the road. You see, the drama begins between Moab and Bethlehem. And I think it's interesting that the drama doesn't begin, in Moab when they set out to go to Canaan, but on the road. And on the road, you have the most famous scene of all, and that is the declaration of Ruth on deciding to cling to Naomi and follow her impoverished, melancholy mother-in-law to foreign turf. So these are the famous lines in Robert Alter's translation. Do not entreat me to forsake you, to turn back from you, for wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people is my people, and your God is my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. So may the Lord do to me, or even more, for only death will part you and me. Ki el asher telchi elech. Ruth's moving oath of love and loyalty is so well known that its beauty and power might go unnoticed. Earlier, Ruth's words merged with those of Orpah, but now that her sister-in-law has left, Ruth speaks differently, shifting from prose to poetry, using parallel clauses or parallelism. This is the predominant feature of biblical poetry. When biblical narrative introduces brief poetic insets into the prose, it often marks a heightened moment, a dramatic scene that calls for special attention. Ruth's oath is one such moment. The majestic opening parallelism with its rhythmic force and emphatic repetition, for wherever you go, I will go, sets the tone for the rest. Ruth's insistence on going with Naomi is nothing short of total. It means lodging wherever Naomi lodges, even if her mother-in-law finds no real abode in Bethlehem. It means going so far as adopting her mother-in-law's people and God as her own. Only death will part them, but in a sense, not even death, for Ruth is determined to be buried wherever her mother-in-law is buried. Although Ruth is a model daughter-in-law, her phenomenal declaration of loyalty is not lauded by Naomi. Instead of falling in Ruth's arms and expressing her gratitude, Naomi does not utter a word. Characters in the Bible, as Robert Alter points out, are often unpredictable, in some ways impenetrable, constantly emerging from and slipping back into a penumbra of ambiguity. One of the wonders of biblical narrative, in fact, lies in its invitation, or rather its demand, that we explore silences and consider divergent possibilities of motive and emotional response. Although the biblical narrator is omniscient, we as readers are not. We must learn about characters the same way we learn about the people in our daily lives, through ongoing conjecture. We may surmise that Naomi's choice to cease talking with Ruth on the road discloses her ambivalence. Despite her genuine care for her daughter-in-law, she may be reluctant to have her by her side. Is Naomi troubled now that they're approaching Bethlehem by Ruth's Moabite origin? Is she worried about the reaction of the people of her hometown to her foreign daughter-in-law? But there's another interpretive route. We may equally assume that her silence is a mark of her deep melancholy. Miserable as Naomi is, she may be feeling unworthy of her daughter-in-law's compassion, or else incapable of delighting in the remarkable gift of chesed offered to her. Whatever the reasons for this lacunae may be, the two women continue to walk together to Bethlehem, and Naomi no longer tries to dissuade Ruth. Strictly speaking, only Ruth is a migrant who enters an unknown town, but in many ways, Naomi too is a migrant, or even a double migrant. Her first migration was to Moab, and now on returning to Bethlehem after 10 years away, and after the disasters that befell her, she feels acutely uprooted yet again. When the women rush towards Naomi as she enters Bethlehem and ask, "Is this Naomi, Hazot Naomi?" They probably find it difficult to recognize her after all these years, but Naomi regards their question on a different register as relevant to her deep sense of estrangement. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai, the Almighty, has dealt great bitterness to me. I went out full, and empty did the Lord bring me back. Why should you call me Naomi when the Lord has borne witness against me and Shaddai has done me harm? She conveys her inner alienation by dissociating herself from her name, the quintessential marker of identity. The name Naomi, akin to the Hebrew word pleasant, no longer suits her, she laments. A more appropriate name would be Mara, the bitter one. Not unlike Job, Naomi protests against a God who has tortured her mercilessly with no apparent reason. So she's a sort of female counterpart of Job. I mean, get a very brief kind of quarrel with God, but it's right there. Once again, there's shift from prose to poetry, underscoring the emotional intensity of the moment. In a forceful parallelism, Naomi juxtaposes her emptiness with the fullness with which she was blessed on leaving for Moab. I went out full, and empty did the Lord bring me back. Ani melea halachti v'rika meshivani Adonai. If earlier on the road she spoke of God's hand leveled against her, now that she has returned without her husband and sons to an empty home, she spells out her complaint toward the heavens in bold strokes. This is a dire opening note, but shortly after, we discover Ruth's resilience. Ruth, like many other migrants and migrant workers, is determined to find a way to solve their most immediate problem, hunger. She gleans in the field of Boaz, who, as it turns out, is a relative of Naomi. Having heard of Ruth's remarkable loyalty to Naomi, Boaz welcomes her to his field and sends her home with extra grain. But once the harvest season is over and the danger of hunger hovers once again in the air, Naomi and Ruth must seek a different venue. Ruth goes to the threshing floor one night and lies near Boaz. It is a scene of subtle seduction. It's very ambiguous. The word lie appears time and again, but it's ambiguous. So sexuality is only intimated but not spelled out. And you have to remember that she's a Moabite, and the founding mother of the Moabites is Lot's daughters who slept with their father. So something kind of dubious in the background, but it's very mild in the Book of Ruth. It's intimate. It's very mysterious. It's an enigmatic scene, but it's ambiguous as far as the seduction scene goes. When Boaz wakes up startled, Ruth urges him to spread his wing over her and become her goel, redeemer, namely, marry her. Put differently, Ruth urges him to follow the Levirate law. And the Levirate law, you have a sort of legal subtext to the Book of Ruth, and this is one of the gleaning too is part of the sort of legal corpus of the Bible. But the Levirate law is a very interesting law. It is an injunction that if a married man dies without children, it is the duty of a brother or other near relative to marry the widow, and the son of the union is reckoned to be the son of the first husband. So it's a way of sort of creating some kind of familial continuity. And primarily, according to the biblical, but it's also a way of sort of taking care of the widow. But of course, it disrupts the family, as you can imagine. Sort of means that you're marrying your sister-in-law, and that's not an easy task. The Book of Ruth, with its tale of migration, has become a key text in current reassessments of the question of migration. Two of the most prominent readings in this connection are those of Julia Kristeva and Bonnie Honig. Both call into question the tendency to regard the Book of Ruth as an uncomplicated story of happy conversion and acceptance of the stranger, but there are distinct differences between the two. In Kristeva's Strangers to Ourselves from 1988, she explores the notion of the stranger, the foreigner, outsider or alien in a country or society not their own, as well as the notion of strangeness within the self. With characteristic virtuosity, Kristeva explores a highly variegated set of texts, from Greek tragedy in the Bible to Camus' Stranger and Freud's The Uncanny. The Book of Ruth is among the texts she discusses. Kristeva marvels at the positioning of foreignness at the very foundation of the house of David, and claims, it's not here, so I'll just read it. Ruth the foreigner is there to remind those unable to read that the divine revelation often requires a lapse, the acceptance of radical otherness, the recognition of a foreignness that one might have tended at the very first to consider the most degraded. This was not an encouragement to deviate or proselytize, but an invitation to consider the fertility of the other. More recently, Bonnie Honig, who's a political theorist, regards Ruth as the model immigrant. Reading the Book of Ruth within the context of political theory and the symbolic politics of immigration, and she offers an interesting critique of Kristeva's reflection on Ruth, underscoring the ways in which foreignness helps shore up national identities while generating social unease and ambivalence. While Naomi is restored to the community, Ruth's closing silence, she argues, may be construed as indicative of her failed assimilation and ongoing mourning as an exile. Now, interestingly enough, Naomi too is silent at the end, but I think Honig's perception is thought-provoking. Ultimately, although Ruth is something of a foreign founder, she ends up being relegated to the margins. Her tale is a tale of incomplete mourning and failed transition, so she claims. In my own reading of the Book of Ruth, as my retelling of the story indicated, I consider both the exceptionally favorable presentation of Ruth, but also moments of ambivalence towards the strangers. And what I also add to the picture is the migratory experiences of Naomi. In highlighting the migratory, so this is like the Book of Ruth in a nutshell, but I mean, it's a short text, but there's so much to do with the biblical text itself. But we're going to move on to the question of reception. In highlighting the migratory dimension of the Book of Ruth, I explore the theme that seems to me as the most compelling for our own 21st century. I regard this ancient tale as an incredibly rich turf for the exploration of migratory experiences that remain only too relevant today: the acute sense of uprootedness, the struggle to find sustenance in a foreign land, the resilience and audacity that are required in order to survive, the yearnings for home, and the quest for a new beginning. Migration is one of the most pressing problems of our time, but migration concerns us not only in the political sphere. It touches on our personal lives in profound ways. Many of us are either immigrants ourselves or children and grandchildren of immigrants, or some combination thereof. The bulk of my book revolves around Ruth's readers, numerous readers from diverse cultural and religious backgrounds and across many centuries have been utterly charmed by Ruth. I explore some of Ruth's most captivating afterlives. She appears as a convert in the Midrash. Convert is not a biblical term. She's sort of recast as a convert in the Midrash. As the Shekhinah in exile, the female aspect of the deity in the Zohar, as a local pastoral gleaner in French art, as a woman pioneer in early Zionism, and as a paradigmatic stranger and outcast in renditions of the 20th and 21st centuries. In each chapter of Ruth's long biography, she undergoes a cultural translation as she's made relevant within a new historical context. In each exegetical scene, her foreignness acquires different meanings. And now we move to Agnon. Of the various afterlives of Ruth, I have chosen to single out Agnon's reading of the ancient tale in his renowned novella, In the Prime of Her Life, Bidmi Yamea, published in 1923. I thought it would be especially relevant for this occasion, given that Agnon's writings loom large in Anne's work. And Anne's fabulous book, Between Exile and Return, introduced an inspiring new perspective in the field with its emphasis on a more restless Agnon. In Anne's superb readings of key texts in the Agnonian corpus, she highlights the ways in which Agnon moves between exile and return, enacting dramas of presence and absence, of attachment and loss. And although she did not write about Bidmi Yamea in this book, the topics that were pivotal in her work, as we shall see, are most relevant to this novella as well. So this is 1923, and it's so interesting because Agnon is just like ahead of his time. Thinking of Ruth as a migrant is something that will become very prominent in Israeli culture and literature in the past few decades. But he's doing it way before everyone else. And at the time, I think that the predominant notion of Ruth was of the pastoral gleaner. And the book of Ruth was perceived as a blissful story of a happy return to the land of Israel. So she becomes an olah rather than an immigrant. And, it becomes part of the revival. And I'll just, this is sort of typical. This is Ze'ev Rabban. Oh, you hear me? No. Try to complicate life. So Ze'ev Rabban is one, is part of the Betzalel school, sort of early art school in Jerusalem. The building still exists there, and there's still, it's still art, art students there. But this is the very beginning. And he has a whole book with illustrations of the Book of Ruth. And he also has a wonderful book with illustrations of the Song of Songs. But this is, I would say, his most prominent take on the Book of Ruth. And you can see her. She's the pastoral gleaner, Orientalist coloring and clothing, Again, very typical of the sort of Bezalel style in the early 20th century. And it's a blissful return to the land of Israel. I mean, this was primarily the predominant notion. This is 1930, okay? So it's a few years after Agnon writes, in the prime of her life. Just to give you one more example, Yaakov Ben-Dov was the head of the photography department in Bezalel. Again, the same sort of art school. And this is a stage photograph. Apparently, it's one of the students in Bezalel who sort of posed as Ruth here. But you see, she's sort of dressed in sort of Oriental clothing. She has sheaves in her hands, now the pastoral Ruth, it's, we can't go into all the details of other chapters in the book, but I deal with the invention of the pastoral Ruth, and this is actually in European art. I mean, it's a very common trope, but then when this trope sort of wanders and it becomes part of the art school of Bezalel, it has sort of another twist. This is part of the sort of revival of Jewish agriculture in the land of Israel, and Ruth becomes prominent in this respect. So I just wanted you to have a glimpse of this in order to see how different Agnon is and how restless he is, again, thinking of Anne's definition of his work. Okay, so now we're going back. The Ruth-like narrator of the novella, Tirza, doesn't walk with sheaves of barley in the fields of Bethlehem, nor is she a pioneer building a new nation. She lives in a small town in Galicia, Buchach, or Shibush, as Agnon calls it, and Shibush means distortion in Hebrew, and leads a domestic bourgeois life typical of well-off Jewish families in the early 20th century. The one exceptional activity in Tirza's world is writing. She's not only the narrator of the tale, but also its writer, the only female narrator and the only female writer in Agnon's writing. I always say that this is his Madame Bovary. He's sort of identifying with a woman's perspective, and really a remarkable sort of portrait of this woman. So Tirza writes in Hebrew, or rather in the biblical Hebrew characteristic of writers of Jewish enlightenment, but has no intention of becoming a Zionist. Her writing remains detached from the surrounding Eastern European community, much as it remains detached from Zionist endeavors. In Bidmi Yamea, Agnon offers a highly nuanced modernist revision of the Book of Ruth, where moments of self-estrangement and ambivalence in the biblical text are intensified in bold strokes. Ruth's tale is reimagined primarily via the relationship of Tirza and her mother, Leah. And while casting Tirza in the role of a dislocated Ruth, Agnon envisions Tirza's mother as an acutely morbid Naomi. Sort of remember Naomi mourning, crying, saying, "I went out full and empty, did the Lord bring me back?" But Tirza's mother doesn't protest against God or anyone else for that matter, but suffers from an acute sense of emptiness that is never alleviated. And whereas in the Book of Ruth, Naomi eventually seems to be more willing to accept and acknowledge Ruth's love, her Agnonian counterpart remains incurably indifferent. Tirza opens her tale with a memorable elegiac tone, beautifully captured in the recording of Agnon's reading of it. It's available on YouTube. So you hear Agnon, he's really sort of monotonous, melancholy kind of soundtrack. She depicts her mother's untimely, and I think this is the most renowned opening of modern Hebrew literature. It's like Dickens' opening in the Tirza opens her tale. Okay, so this is how it goes. I'll read it first in Hebrew. Just a few lines so you can hear the music. He's really lost in translation, Agnon, but even Even so, he's amazing. But so this is the Hebrew. בדמי ימיה מתה אמי, כבת 30 שנה ושנה הייתה אמי במותה, מעט ורעים היו ימי שני חייה. כל היום ישבה בבית, ומן הבית לא יצאה. My mother died in the prime of her life. She was barely 31 years old. Few and harsh were the days of her life. She sat at home the entire day and never stirred from within. Her friends and neighbors did not visit, nor did my father welcome guests. Our house stood hushed in sorrow. Its doors did not open to a stranger. Lying in her bed, my mother spoke scarcely a word, but when she did speak, it was as though limpid wings had spread forth and led me to the hall of blessing. How I loved her voice. Often I would open her door just to hear her ask, "Who's there?" Her illness, a heart ailment, bowed her life down. Tilza harks back to her childhood. She recalls her childish attempt to draw her mother's attention by opening the door. "Who's there?" her mother would ask, and Tilza could pretend for a moment that her mother actually noticed her and could take her under blessed maternal wings. Her mother may have seemed a merciful nurse, achot to outside observers, but in fact, she was the patient, a melancholy mother who could take care of no one, not even her daughter. Despite her mother's indifference, Tilza wishes to merge with her in every possible way. She could have declared with the biblical Ruth, "Do not entreat me to forsake you, to turn back from you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you die, I will die. So may the Lord do to me, or even more, for only death will part you and me." But death doesn't part Tilza from her mother. Quite the contrary, her mother's death only kindles her need to merge with her. Tilza spends the rest of her life trying to step into her mother's world, so much so that she insists on marrying Akavya Mazal, the lover whom her mother could not marry. Get the picture? Mazal, and I mean, her mother and Mazal were in love, but the father of Leah, of her grandfather, in fact, rejected Mazal as a sort of potential husband. And Tilza now tries to mend the distortion in her mother's life. Okay. The Levirate law seems today as a relic of the past that has no significance in current times, but in Agnon's translation of it into modern terms, it becomes relevant once again, recast as an emotional drive to preserve familial continuity. The objective in this case being to commemorate the deceased mother while implementing her unfulfilled dreams. Agnon's modification of the Levirate law is closer to the biblical text than it may first seem. Already in the book of Ruth, as we have seen, the implementation of the Levirate law is meant not only to rescue Machlon's name, that's Ruth's husband, from oblivion, but also, and perhaps even more so, to fill the void in Naomi's life. Tilza seeks to continue along the road her mother could not take, to mend past wrongs, but ends up creating new distortions. In Agnon's novella, the book of Ruth blends with Ecclesiastes, with Kohelet, and especially with the famous verse, "The crooked cannot turn straight." And there's also an Agnonian tale with this title. "Uvat lo yochal litkon." For no distortion can be fully repaired. By the way, even one of the dogs is called me'uvat, distortion. If Leah was forced to follow her father's choice and marry the rich mince instead of Mazal, the love of her life, Tilza is determined to marry for love. And yet, in embracing her mother's amorous choice and seducing Akavya Mazal, the man who could have been her father, Tilza drifts into an unsettling, incestuous realm. There is no biblical or civil law that Tilza and Akavya Mazal violate in getting married, but psychologically, the attraction to a father substitute can be as uncanny as literal incest. Agnon does not hesitate to bolster the incestuous shadows in Ruth's tale. Remember, I mentioned Sodom, where Lot's daughters, sleep with their father. But here we have a modernist take of that. And sort of in the book of Ruth itself, it's very dim in the background, right? So Agnon does not hesitate to bolster the incestuous shadows in Ruth's tale, but he does so with a Freudian touch. Although Agnon took pleasure in denying the fact that he read Freud, he also denied the fact that he read Kafka. His work is undoubtedly indebted to psychoanalytic theory. In this case, he explores the power and dangers of incestuous drives, while considering the ways in which they inevitably introduce an element of estrangement in the midst of our very homes. At the end in the prime of her life, the pregnant Tirza is about to give birth to the child her mother could not have with Mazal. Tirza would have liked, as it were, to be like Ruth, whose son, Oved, is placed at Naomi's bosom. But Tirza's mother is dead, and the incestuous dimension of her cravings now loom large and weigh upon her in ways she finds difficult to bear. On one wintry night, Akavia Mazal comes up to her and sings a lullaby while embracing her. Her father, in turn, takes out a pair of slippers and a red cap, presents for his future grandson, imitating a child's piping voice. Both speak of the baby to be born. Both treat Tirza as a child of sorts. Commenting on this moment, Tirza writes, I behold the two men and long to cry in my mother's bosom. My father and my husband sit at the table, their faces shining upon me. By dint of their love and compassion, each resembles the other. Evil has 70 faces, and love has but one face. Tirza's words call to mind the memorable opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, another very famous opening line. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Agnon provides an ironic variation. Here, a supposedly happy family is miserable in its own unique way. The bewildered Tirza now realizes more than ever before that her husband is something of a father and that her greatest wish remains to find shelter in her mother's bosom. Writing, she admits, is her only solace. It assuages the loss and brings her closer to a sense of reparation and maturation. On approaching motherhood, on feeling the child within growing from day to day, Tirza ventures to plunge into the story of her life and record its unmistakable distortions, mingled as they are with her ever-vital cravings to mend the past. In Agnon's work, individual loves are often intertwined with collective loves, or rather offer a meditation on broader cultural phenomena. The invitation to think in national terms about the amorous bonds in the prime of her life is embedded in Agnon's choice of names. Leah is one of the biblical matriarchs, and Akavia derives from the name Jacob. But since Agnon's Leah is also something of a Rachel, the beloved matriarch dies in the prime of her life, the entire biblical nexus of Leah, Rachel, Jacob hovers in the background. This legendary triangle from Genesis, however, is inextricably connected to the book of Ruth. In the closing scene of the book of Ruth, the elders bless Ruth as a new matriarch of sorts who is destined to follow in the footsteps of her notable precursors, Rachel and Leah, and in building the house of Israel. But what happens, Agnon seems to ask, to those who seek to rebuild the house of Israel in modern times? In the prime of her life is, among other things, Agnon's ironic response to the Zionist privileging of Ruth as an emblem of redemptive homecoming and acculturation within the old new pastoral settings of the land of Israel. Characteristically, Agnon probes both the charms and delusional aspects of Zionist biblicism. Is such a return to biblical times possible? What makes it so enticing? Can one actually return after so many centuries of exile to the land of Israel and reenact biblical scenes? How successful can this modern attempt for tikkun, repair, of exile possibly be? Agnon was well aware of the Zoharic, and here I sort of go back to the Zohar's reading of the book of Ruth, where, the book of Ruth is a book of tikkun, it's a book of repair. In fact, in a section on the commentaries of the Book of Ruth in Agnon's anthology, Book, Writer, Story, Sefer Sipur V'Sofer, he cites a few passages from the Zohar on Ruth. In more subtle ways, Agnon intimates that there are more similarities between Zionist exegetes and Zoharic ones than meets the eye. Although Zionism presented itself as a decisive break with diasporic Jewish traditions, ironically, its quest to repair the exilic condition bears a curious resemblance to the Kabbalistic quest for the tikkun of the uprooted Shekhinah. In both cases, repair seems to be more of a passionate dream than a remedy for the dislocations of the world. So we could do much more with Agnon, but I'm just going to end with this illustration of Adines. So you see, it's Adines. This is from 2006. He's a contemporary, well-known contemporary Israeli artist. And he has a series called Biblical Portraits. And here you see, you know, this is like many decades after, but in Israeli culture today, I think the whole sort of migratory dimension of Ruth is far more visible. And in this stage photograph, you see how different it is from the stage photograph of the early B'Tzalel, sort of, with the sort of B'Tzalel student. So now this is, again, it's a stage photograph. And he's in dialogue with the B'Tzalel artist. But his stage photograph of Ruth and Naomi shows two women dressed in rags, picking dropped onions, not from a field, but rather from an unpaved street littered with refuse. Ness invites us to ask, who are the Ruth and Naomi of our age? In Ness's hands, the Book of Ruth is no longer a founding text about an idyllic return to the biblical homeland. The true continuation of these biblical tales in contemporary Israel and beyond are the homeless and migrant workers on the margins. So I'm going to end with this kind of glimpse of another sort of layer of the reception of the Book of Ruth in Israeli culture in today's world. And now, you know, in Shavuot, you always read the book of Ruth, and in many tikkunei Shavuot, you see Adi Ness's photograph instead of Ze'ev Rabban. So give you an idea of how Agnon was ahead of his time. But, you know, Agnon is altogether different. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Ilana, for that wonderful lecture, which gave our audience a little taste of the richness of your book. I highly recommend to all of you that you read it in its entirety. It's a beautiful book if you haven't already. What I love about Ilana's book is the way it holds up the Book of Ruth as a mirror for the desires and concerns of so many individuals and groups over the centuries. Although, of course, one book cannot address all of the possible interpretations of this jewel of a biblical story, Ruth, A Migrant's Tale, includes both well-known engagements with the Book of Ruth, such as European paintings of pastoral gleaners, and more esoteric examples like the identification of Ruth with Shekinah in the Zohar. Although the example she chose to single out in her lecture, Agnon's novella In the Prime of Her Life, showcases Ilana's brilliance as a literary critic, she brings the same level of acute observation to her interpretations of paintings and photographs and films that deal explicitly or implicitly with the themes of the Book of Ruth. In my response, I want to think a bit with Ilana's book about why the Book of Ruth is not often read as a migrant's tale in traditional Jewish and Christian interpretation, and then share a few insights from my own research about how the Book of Ruth speaks to the challenges that facing migrants around the world today. It has become more common, as Ilana said, in recent years to mention the Book of Ruth in religious responses to issues of global migration. Just a couple of weeks ago, two University of Chicago Divinity School faculty, Erin Galgay-Walsh and Marshall Cunningham, wrote an opinion piece for Religion News Service entitled, In the Bible's Immigrant Story, a Model for Humanizing the Vulnerable, which focuses mainly on the Book of Ruth. But if you ask the average Jewish or Christian Bible reader what the Book of Ruth is about, they are unlikely to mention migration. As Ilana's chapter, The Convert, demonstrates, in rabbinic midrash, Ruth becomes the model of a female convert, gioret in Mishnaic Hebrew, which is the feminine form of ger. Although in biblical Hebrew, the word ger means sojourner, a resident alien, in rabbinic literature, its association with migration disappears, being replaced by the meaning convert. The understanding of Ruth as a convert is based primarily on her vow to Naomi in Ruth 1:16-17, which, as you heard, contains the phrases, your people is or will be my people, and your God, my God. A midrash in Ruth Rabbah understands each and every phrase of Ruth's vow as expressing her determination to convert, despite Naomi's repeated attempts to discourage her. Ilana points out that the rabbis who uphold Ruth as a model of conversion do so because they see her as entirely repudiating her Moabite identity. The minority of rabbis who identify her as a Moabite do so in order to cast doubt on her virtue. There is no in-between scenario where she maintains her identity as a migrant or a foreign woman, but is also a model of virtue. As Ilana notes at the end of the chapter on Ruth the convert, there is very little Christian exegetical literature on the book of Ruth, despite the inclusion of Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. It's sort of surprising that more Christians didn't talk about the book of Ruth. Ilana explores the Christian reception of Ruth mainly in the chapter, The Pastoral Gleaner, which briefly traces the representation of Ruth in Christian iconography before turning to Ruth's more prominent appearance in the pastoral scenes of 17th to 19th century European painting. She observes that Ruth's foreignness is consistently minimized in Christian art, as she tends to resemble the people of Bethlehem, in the paintings in attire and appearance. This may be a visual representation of her inclusion among the Israelite ancestors of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, Ilana suggests. This is also true of the romanticized depiction of Ruth as a gleaner in pastoral art. Even the orientalizing representations of Ruth in the 19th century do not distinguish her from the other Oriental beauties in the scene. So it is little wonder that Ruth's migrant identity is often forgotten. In her chapter on the book of Ruth itself, titled The Moabite, Ilana lingers over Ruth's identification of herself to Boaz when she's gleaning in his field as a foreigner, nochriah, rather than a sojourner, ger, a term which would more accurately reflect her legal status, although it does not occur in the book of Ruth. Ilana points out several possible reasons for this word choice, all of which relate to Ruth's experience as a migrant. On a psychological level, Ilana reads nochriah as expressing Ruth's, quote, sense of acute estrangement on making her first steps in an unknown land, unquote. At the same time, she suggests that Ruth chooses this less privileged term because, quote, she realizes what migrants and fugitives must realize if they want to survive, that self-deprecation is a vital strategy, unquote. Third, she notes that the words for recognize and foreigner share the same root, nun chaf resh, even though their meanings are antithetical. She sees this as Ruth's way of calling attention to Boaz's unusual choice to acknowledge a stranger, given that strangers usually remain invisible. All of these brilliant observations make Ruth's experience relatable to that of migrants today. But I would like to suggest another interpretation of Ruth's use of the term nochriah, that she's unaware of her rights as a ger. The feminine term does not occur in the Bible, because Naomi does not inform her of them. When Ruth announces her intention to go out and glean behind someone in whose eyes I might find favor, in chapter 2, verse 2, not only does Naomi fail to mention her relative Boaz, but she also fails to inform Ruth that as a widow and a sojourner, she's entitled by Israelite law to glean in whosever field she chooses. I mention this because it points to the importance for migrants of knowing their legal rights, but also because it's only the first example of Naomi keeping Ruth in the dark about Israelite customs and laws. When Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor in the next chapter, she doesn't reveal that there is a goel, a redeeming kinsman, who has a prior claim to her land, nor apparently that the role of goel has anything to do with land redemption, since Ruth seems to believe it's only about marriage. She says to Boaz when he awakes, quote, spread your cloak, or literally wing, over your servant, for you are a goel. As Ilana points out, Ruth's words recall both Boaz's own words to her in chapter 2 about seeking shelter under the wing of the God of Israel, or wings of the God of Israel, and the image for the covenantal marriage between God and Israel in Ezekiel 16:8. When the nearer relative appears in chapter 4, it appears that he assumes that the role of the goel is limited to redeeming Naomi's land, in accordance with the law of land redemption in Leviticus 25. Naomi put both Ruth and Boaz in a compromising position by sending Ruth to the threshing floor without telling her about the prior claim of the other redeeming kinsman on her land. Ilana reminded us in her presentation that, quote, one of the wonders of biblical narrative, in fact, lies in its invitation, or rather its demand, that we explore silences and consider divergent possibilities of motive and emotional response, end quote. I admit that my own interpretation of the Book of Ruth has changed radically since I began my current project of exploring marginalized readings of it by both minoritized biblical scholars and lay readers, by which I mean readers who are not trained as biblical scholars. One of the groups of lay readers I discussed Ruth with was a group consisting of immigrants to Costa Rica and other Costa Ricans who assist both immigrants and migrants who are passing through on their way to North America. I only have time to share a couple of examples of how this experience opened my eyes to new, quote, possibilities of motive and emotional response in the Book of Ruth. In 2017, I wrote a short reflection holding up the people of Bethlehem in the Book of Ruth as a model of welcoming migrants. How naive that now seems to me. Several members of this group interpreted the silence of the women of Bethlehem about Ruth's presence at the end of chapter 1 as an expression of xenophobia, as a passive-aggressive way of excluding her because they perceived her as a threat. I had always paid more attention to Naomi's silence about Ruth at this point in the story rather than that of the women of Bethlehem. Others pointed out that Naomi had probably anticipated this reaction, and that was why she tried so hard to convince her daughters-in-law to return to Moab, and was silent when Ruth insisted on staying with her. One member interpreted Ruth's clinging to Naomi not so much as a choice as a trauma response. She was unable to imagine her life without Naomi. All of these readings were, I believed, informed by their own experiences as migrants. Another blow to my romantic reading of the book was when someone characterized Boaz's praise of Ruth for leaving behind her father and mother and her native land in chapter 2, verse 11, as implying, quote, conditional acceptance. You will be welcomed here only if you negate your past. And another person said that the conversation between Ruth and Boaz and the overseer, about Ruth between Boaz and the overseer of the harvesters disgusted her because it reminded her of the way employers sometimes boast about how hardworking their migrant laborers are, even as they underpay them. I could go on, but I just wanted to share a few examples of how the Book of Ruth might speak to the experiences of migrants today that had not occurred to me before I read it with people who had experienced the harsh realities of migration in the current global climate. I want to thank you, Ilana, for lifting up Ruth as a migrant's tale and showing us some of the ways, the many ways it has been interpreted and perhaps misinterpreted over the centuries to the extent that those ways have obscured Ruth's identity as a migrant. Thank you all for your attention, and we will shortly open up the discussion to questions from the audience. But first, I want to give Ilana an opportunity to respond to.
This was marvelous, really. I mean, and now that the book is out there in the world, I feel sorry when I hear about it. Such an interesting new kind of story of reception that I could have added. The migrants from Costa Rica and so on that you interviewed or talked about the Book of Ruth. These biblical texts are infinite. I think I'm just, we sort of chatted this morning for a cup of coffee and tea. I think this is what happens with great literature, whether it's biblical or not, that at each and every point of our lives and in different contexts, and in our own lives, I'm not talking about, the Midrash or the rabbis versus today. Even in our own lives, we undergo so many changes in the way we sort of view the Book of Ruth. So I first wrote about the Book of Ruth in Counter Traditions in the Bible. This is 1992, so many years ago. And then I wasn't interested in reception at all. That wasn't the thing, but I was really interested in but again, this was the rise of feminist biblical criticism. I sort of wrote it in the late 1980s. And I was thrilled that finally you have two women in the Bible who have a great relationship. This is really rare because mostly when you get, first of all, you hardly get any depiction of women's relationship, because this is not the main issue. The main issue is, if you get representations of women, it's mostly in relation to the men in their lives. And here, all of a sudden, you had the focus. First of all, it's one of the exceptions of the tale is the fact that you have female protagonists, and that the relationship between them is a set center stage. This is really unusual, because when you have women together in the Bible, they usually fight and quarrel. Think of Rachel and Leah about a man or a child or whatever, or Hannah and Penina. This is sort of the typical representation of women. And I said, finally, there's love between women. It's remarkable. And actually, my main argument was that this is a rereading of the story of Rachel and Leah, who appear in at the end of the book of Ruth. So I still maintain something of that older version, but it's true that in the course of time, I saw more of the ambivalence, and for me too, that was something. But it's more nuanced, in my own reading. Even today, I think there's something exceptionally intimate and special and unique about this commitment of these women to each other in dire times. It's true that Ruth's commitment is far more pronounced, nonetheless. I also see a sort of gradual change in Naomi's perception of Ruth, but there are moments of ambivalence. But I would also say that it's a more complex understanding of human relationships. That you do have moments of ambivalence, and that too is part of the scene. So this is apropos your own. So I feel that I too, and also I would say with each and every afterlife or later adaptations of the Book of Ruth, I learned something new about the text. So I can definitely see why, this is why, also because I knew that Karina was going to talk about it. This is why I ended with Adi Ness's photo, a stage photograph. Because I think in today's world, this is what really seems much more palpable. The dire conditions, and here too, the Book of Ruth offers us a remarkable kind of perspective. What does it mean to glean? Do you know what it means to glean? These pastoral paintings are kind of misleading. They're always attuned to something in the text, but at the expense of the other. But I think that maybe today we're shifting in the other direction of thinking too much of migration and less about other things. But gleaning means that you sort of rely on bits and pieces and leftovers, in so many words. So you're picking up leftovers in the field, and this is what is meant to sustain you. This is like nothing. So I think it's very short and it's very brief, but it does give you a picture of the resilience. You know what it means to go each and every day to glean in the fields. You need to have some resilience and some sense of hope. Something will change. But I also find it consoling because, I taught it during COVID. I taught it now, with the war, and each and every time you sort of think about it in different ways. But it is also a text about, how do you face disasters in your lives and move on. That's still something that I find very compelling about.
So now we'll open it up for questions from the audience, and Magda will pass the microphone.
Thanks a lot. That was fascinating, but I would very much take an issue with the concept of migration, because it seems to me that both Moab, just from reading the story, the family goes from Judea to Moab because there is basically no job, no harvest. and they are absorbed there without any, they're assimilated without any problem. Clearly, there is no linguistic difference. Clearly, there is no social difference, no economic. The sons marry local women, and they kind of live there till they die, and then they go back again. There is, they all speak the same language. And it's kind of like, if migration is like migration from New York to New Jersey. I mean,
That would be a very
and-
dramatic transition.
But my point is, what I'm trying to say is that maybe this is not the point of the story. I understand that it can be construed in that way, but maybe it is not the point of the story, nor is the conversion the point of the story, because what's striking about Ruth is how both Naomi and Ruth treat each other's gods as something, Naomi politely says, go back to your father and your gods. And equally indifferently, Ruth agrees that, that her gods will be, Naomi's gods, Naomi's God. And it again, there is such an indifference to this whole kind of theological thing. And of course, notoriously, when somebody converts to Mary, it's much less about theological convictions than the willing to be with the other person, where theology is clearly very unimportant. So I'm just really curious whether we're reading maybe too much into a wonderful text that is basically best left read as it is without any comment.
Thank you. That's an interesting comment, because you see that the text as it is, I mean, the perception of what the text is all about, or what is innate about the text, changes continuously. And I think this is precisely what observing the different chapters in the reception of the text reveals. Because, for the rabbis, it can be a convert, and this is very much part of their world. For, the Kabbalist, she can be a Shekhinah in exile. Or, French artist, she's a pastoral gleaner, and so on and so forth. And for Agnon, she's an estranged woman in Galicia, right, writing in Hebrew. So I think this is precisely what makes reception so interesting. I mean, and talking about the ways in which our own readings have changed. I think this is, I mean, what reception allows you to perceive is that things that you take for granted about the text can even be taken for granted because they can be read otherwise. So this is an invitation to read otherwise. Now, you don't necessarily have to find this invitation as, the thing that you want to pursue. But I find it really interesting. I mean, more than trying to convince anyone that this is the ultimate reading of the text, I'm interested in opening the text and to viewing the ways in which it can be read in different ways. And this is why I was emphasizing the question of the lacunae. There's so many different ways in which to read some of these silences. So I would say this is something that I try to convey. Again, for many years, and in many contexts, it wasn't perceived as a migratory tale. So I think other aspects in the text were highlighted, but then what I try to do is to foreground and let me just say one more thing. Ruth is a migrant. She's moving from Moab to Bethlehem. And another small detail is that all the foreign characters in the Bible speak Hebrew, including Pharaoh. So this is not unusual. So,
I had a thought or comment from sort of the opposite side. I'm not a biblical scholar at all, but it occurred to me thinking about Ruth this morning and listening tonight. She's constantly in motion. Naomi is constantly in motion. And when Ruth can finally stop, that is when she marries Boaz and gives birth to Oved, the movement keeps going. you know, Oved goes to Naomi, who is his foster mother, and then the meaning of the whole history of the Jewish people changes. And in a certain sense, Ruth seems like, I mean, in the one sense, you can say she's shoring up the patriarchy or whatever, and she is, but she's also this agent of change and force that keeps going beyond her. And I just noticed it now and thought it was interesting.
Yeah, no, it's no, I think that's a great comment question. I think that the question of the move of being, I think that it's well put. I think it's a very beautiful observation. It's something. Sorry. Oh, get carried away. Yeah, because I think that in general, there's something of emotion, you know, of going on. I think sort of moving on. I mean, I think in part I was sort of depicting gleaning in this way. If you go every day and you insist on gleaning, even though you're just, you know, collecting bits and pieces, you're sort of moving ahead. Voni Honig, whom I mentioned earlier, actually defines Ruth as a founding mother. She's a founder. So I mean, it's another way of talking about the ending, where, or maybe I should add Kristeva here too. When the sort of the unexpected. I mean, my greatest hope today is the unexpected. The unexpected will surprise us in a good way. It may happen. But unexpectedly, the foreigner sets things into motion. And so this is a more favorable kind of notion of what Ruth allows for. You know, she doesn't give up. She doesn't give up, you know, she doesn't leave Naomi behind, which is the commonsensical thing to do. You know, you're following your mother-in-law into a foreign land when she has no resources whatsoever. This is not a trivial move. So there's something very bold about her character, and this is part of why I think she's compelling. But she's setting things in motion. She's also actually, I think it begins. So it's within her relationship with Naomi, but also in her relationship with Boaz. She sort of entices him or sort of lures him into action. You know, she says, "You can be the redeemer. You know, don't talk about God as a redeemer. You can be the redeemer. There's, you know, God is definitely there, but it's human agency and human goodness that sets everything in motion."
I would just add that, you know, the Christian tradition or the Gospel of Matthew picks that up, right, and carries it forward, right? It's very unusual to include a woman in a genealogy, but she's included in Jesus' genealogy. So I think it's a carrying forward of that same momentum.
So I want to thank you for this really incredible inaugural lecture, Anne Golomb Hoffman lecture. It was like perfect first, and many more. Thank you to the Hoffman family for making this such a special occasion. Thank you, Ilana, Karina, for really stimulating talk. And I think we can continue our conversations at the reception in the back. So thank you so much again.